Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Choe. In a surprise turn of events, President Trump and Chairman Kim's meeting was cut short and ended without a deal. The two sides give different accounts as to what went wrong. In this special episode, we discuss the breakdown of the second summit and its implications.
They were willing to denuke a large portion of the areas that we wanted, but we couldn't give up all of the sanctions for that.
우리의 이러한 원칙적 입장에는 추호도 변함이 없을 것이고
In the studio with me today, Mr. Thomas Countryman, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman was acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Also joining me today, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. And my guest, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the U.S. government and think tanks. So just briefly, I first want to hear all your thoughts about what happened in Hanoi, what you think about it. Was this a negative or positive for the United States? Why don't we start with Dr. Cronin?
Well, it was a surprise. I think the summit revealed a lot of things, and that's important to gain those kind of insights through negotiation. First, it revealed the bottom line of both leaders to some extent. I think it's no doubt that Chairman Kim is looking for significant sanctions relief right away. That's really important to know. Secondly, the United States and President Trump is interested in complete denuclearization. He was prepared to take a baby step, but not to pay much for it. Kim wanted the ultimate, though. I think we also therefore learned that personal relations only go so far. They don't really change national interests, and neither party was changing national interests.
Yeah, I would say that if a no-deal summit was a bad outcome, why was everybody so relieved? And I think that really we didn't have enough time to prepare for this meeting. The working level talks only went forward for about a month in advance. And I think that essentially both sides weren't really ready. And actually the political environment here also had not been prepared adequately. And so you could see growing anxiety in Washington that maybe President Trump was going for the wrong reason. And that reason went away when Trump decided to walk away from signing a deal.
The result was disappointing, but not so surprising, and not a disaster. The tone of language from both sides after the summit makes clear that they will continue the process, ideally negotiating at a lower level than the national leadership. And as long as we don't return to the fire and fury rhetoric and threats from both sides, this process is still very much alive.
Mm-hmm. So was it a good idea for President Trump to walk out of the meeting?
Well, he left the meeting without a deal. They left amicably. So the door is still open. But I actually take a different view from Tom. I actually think diplomacy has had a big setback here. Chairman Kim can now go back to Pyongyang and consider whether he is willing to make a smaller deal, not ask for much in terms of sanctions relief for just getting part of Yongbyon reactor closed down, or he can make the grand bargain that the President Trump put on the table as well, which is complete denuclearization, complete sanctions relief. It was the only thing that President Trump could do at this point. He should not have gone to a summit without a minimal agreement secure in advance. Once he went there to try to make a deal and had to push it over the top and it didn't work, the only thing he could do was say goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, the minimum bar for success in this interaction actually was to make sure that a process was started. And I think that that's something that didn't happen at the Singapore summit, which produced a declaration, but it may happen as a result of the Hanoi summit. And in fact, it may make a working level process essential as the pathway to get back to any further agreement at the leader level.
And Mr. Countryman, President Trump reportedly asked North Korea to go all in, that U.S. will also go all in as well. Why didn't he go for small incremental results?
From the information available to us, and none of us knows yet exactly what happened in Hanoi, but in the last month or two of intense negotiation between the two sides, there was prepared a smaller deal that would have North Korea take some steps on denuclearization, the U.S. take some steps on ending the state of war that officially still exists. When they got to the summit, it appears that President Trump asked for a much bigger deal and that Mr. Kim also was interested in a bigger, more comprehensive deal. That's a risky maneuver, and it's one that ought to be, in the ideal world, choreographed before the summit. The part that I do understand, for the reasons that Dr. Cronin said, why they couldn't close on that bigger deal. The part I don't understand is why they didn't proceed to make an announcement of a smaller deal, more incremental steps to demonstrate some progress in the relationship.
Exactly, Mr. Snyder. South Korean officials say there were much progress when it came to peace mechanisms and bilateral ties, but why wouldn't they just agree on that?
Well, because we're approaching this in a simultaneous and parallel fashion. And if we go back to the Singapore Declaration, we have 4 points, normalization of relations and peace, but we also have working toward complete denuclearization and POW/MIAs. And in order to move forward, it would be necessary to agree on all parts of that package, rather than simply moving forward on the parts of the package that frankly are of benefit to the North Korean side, maybe to a greater extent than responding to the U.S. core interest.
So, Dr. Cronin, do you think President Trump had the confidence that he could resolve this? Because Secretary Pompeo said in the run-up to the summit, the officials left the contentious issues unresolved intentionally. So was President confident to get this resolved himself?
I think the president probably was confident. He's maybe overly confident, but at the same time, to his credit, he was trying something that nobody had tried before, which is to go to the top decision maker of North Korea and say, look, we can make history here. It was not likely to work, but it's still worth a try. These are very important issues, important stakes. At least try it. And the fact that he didn't run out of the room does keep the door open for further process to develop and for diplomacy. So he's done the right thing, but he shouldn't have rushed to the summit. He could have easily said, look, my schedule's busy. We're making progress at lower levels. Keep making the progress. You know the progress we need, and then we'll have that summit.
So when it comes to why the talks broke down, the president said the North Korea asked all sanctions lifted. But then later North Korea says, no, we wanted only 5 out of 11 sanctions lifted. And then the U.S. official refuted that, saying that those 5s amount to full sanctions relief. So help us understand what this means.
If I could, there's 2 different categories here that are usually lumped together as sanctions. One is what we call strategic trade controls that are meant to keep a country like North Korea from acquiring weapons technology. And then there are classic sanctions, that is economic pressure that is meant to force a country to change its policy. The sanctions the United Nations imposed prior to 2016 were mainly the first category, trying to keep North Korea from acquiring that technology, obviously not fully successfully. It was really only in 2016 that the United Nations Security Council endorsed a full range of economic sanctions. The U.S. government believes it was that economic pressure that brought North Korea to the negotiating table. And once those sanction resolutions are lifted in New York, they are not going to be reimposed in the face of Chinese and Russian opposition. So Mr. Kim was seeking something permanent and irreversible in return for something that was only partial and reversible.
Mr. Snyder, so was North Korea aiming too high, offering only a little?
Well, I think that Tom makes a critical point that as we go into this, we have to look at reversible steps for reversible steps, and then irreversible steps for irreversible steps. And I think that that is the nub of the issue in terms of the way that the U.S. looks at sanctions. And maybe the North Koreans look at it differently. But I think the other critical issue here is that if you make a small deal, you don't get to the questions of intent. And really, on both sides, I think that that is the critical issue to be tested. And so what we are looking for on the U.S. side is Yongbyon plus alpha, because that gives evidence of intent to denuclearize. What the North Koreans may be looking for is a more substantial step on sanctions reduction as evidence of intent to give up a policy that the North Koreans regard as hostile.
Mm-hmm. So regarding that alpha, President Trump said there should be secret facilities and uranium facilities. Secretary Pompeo said there should be warheads, a weapon system, and then also declaration list. But why is North Korea not willing to move beyond Yongbyon at this point?
Well, I mean, the problem is, I think Scott's right. We are looking for evidence. And right now, the evidence points to the fact that Kim is playing the old family playbook. He is giving us the absolute minimum and trying to extract real concessions. Maybe he intends something better than that, because certainly there's enough intelligence out there to say, look, he really wants to change. But at this point, he's not serious enough about it. I think he misjudged President Trump. I think it was misjudgment on both sides. I think Trump misjudged whether Kim could make a deal that Trump would agree to. And I think Kim thought he could go to the summit, and Trump, in a weakened position perhaps, would give him what he wanted. He was going to the summit. And now we retreat to our capitals. Maybe there'll be some more seriousness and sobriety seeping into a process to say, look, let's take another smaller step. Reciprocity has to be part of it, but let's take a step together.
There's another way of interpreting this, and this gets very complicated, because maybe we have a situation where actually on both sides there's a disconnect between the leaders and their bureaucracies. You know, in that system in North Korea, actually the most interesting thing that came out of the summit was Kim Jong-un responding to a reporter's comment saying, I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to denuclearize. I think that was actually the most positive thing that we heard. But it also raises the question, can Kim Jong-un adequately direct his bureaucracy to deliver on that expression of intent? And that's what we need to test. And actually, it's also a test of Trump, because if Kim Jong-un has actually made that decision, Trump is lucky. But for us to capitalize on it, Trump and his team also have to be skilled.
Mm-hmm. And regarding that disconnect, Vice Foreign Minister Choe told South Korean reporters that Chairman Kim is puzzled over U.S.'s strategy and calculations and deal-making styles, because Vice Foreign Minister Choe says if North Korea stopped missile testing for 15 months, they should receive rewards just for that. But then when North Korea is offering Yongbyon on the table, they're not even getting any rewards for that. So what is your take on North Korean response to this reaction to the latest summit results?
Well, it shouldn't be surprising that the U.S. and President Trump's style of deal-making and Mr. Kim's style of deal-making, each of these confuses the other side. There are a number of reasons going way back in history, and not just in reference to these two leaders, where we don't understand the way that we approach these issues. But I do agree with the U.S. position that simply, while a testing moratorium is a good thing and reduces tension, the sanctions were not put in place because of testing. They were put in place because of possession of nuclear weapons, and the goal of the sanctions should be the elimination of those weapons. There is definitely room to get there, starting with closure of Yongbyon, but I don't think it's realistic for North Korea to expect that the whole world would be satisfied with a partial closing of the nuclear complex without actually getting rid of weapons.
Mm-hmm. And South Korean President Moon, in a nationally televised speech, that he will focus on helping North Korea and the U.S. make a deal at this point. So do you agree that at this moment, the breakdown of the Hanoi summit, President Moon is the one who has the most to lose?
I think President Moon is the most vested in the process of peace. And therefore, since this is his legacy issue, he can't move away from it. I think President Trump has other options. He can wait, especially since he's now created a new policy position, essentially, for the United States president. He's going to lower the military tension at the moment and keep it low, but he's going to keep the economic sanctions on. And let's see if North Korea comes in with a more reasonable bargaining sort of position from a U.S. perspective. That's a new position. We don't know how long that'll hold, but that's interesting. It's keeping the door open to diplomacy. It's not lifting the sanctions. And he's saying we're in no rush.
Moon's plans were clearly damaged by the summit breakdown because he wanted to move forward on his peace plan and on the idea of economic integration. And I think that he now has two choices in terms of how he can, two options in terms of how he approaches this. One is to try to continue to move forward, but that's going to generate friction with the United States. The other is to redouble efforts to try to support a process of bringing the United States and North Korea back together through exchange of information and maybe through active behind-the-scenes diplomacy to confirm the understandings in Pyongyang and Washington and try to identify gaps and how to bridge them.
And Mr. Countryman, this is your expertise. North Korea wanted UN sanctions lifted, but is this something that President Trump can give as a concession, especially the UN ones?
Sanctions are not in themselves a policy. Sanctions are a tool, a non-military tool of foreign policy. And in order to be effective, there's two things about them. One, you have to clearly define the goals of your sanctions. And two, you have to have some flexibility in tightening or relaxing sanctions. Now, when it comes to relaxing sanctions, the United States does have options. Both the unilateral sanctions that the U.S. imposed could be eased, and that's a reversible step that the president could pull back if North Korea doesn't cooperate. For example, he could make it easier for North Korea and South Korea to cooperate on specific economic projects. It's very different when you talk about the sanctions that the United Nations Security Council has imposed. It was a lot of effort for first the Obama administration and then the Trump administration to get approval at the Security Council for those sanctions. And once they are lifted, they are not easily put back on. But I think that there is, in this universe of small steps for small steps, there are options that the president can take to ease U.S. unilateral sanctions and make it a little bit easier for North and South Korea to cooperate. And we should consider doing that in return for small but meaningful steps from North Korea.
And this could be good for the alliance. This could be good for President Moon, because those steps could be to kickstart some of those inter-Korean projects. That would be a reasonable price to pay for a small step like part of Yongbyon. So there is a deal to be made if Pyongyang is willing to make it.
And Mr. Snyder, there was a bipartisan criticism on the fact that President Trump in Hanoi said that Chairman Kim only knew about what happened to Mr. Otto Warmbier later on. So what are the perils in negotiating with the leaders of repressive countries?
I think the peril that comes up that may be unique to President Trump is taking the words of the dictator as credible and setting aside evidence to the contrary. And I think that that is something that, that bothers the U.S. Congress quite a bit, and it's very different from the approach that other presidents have had on that sort of set of issues.
And Dr. Cronin, so after the breakdown of a big summit, do you expect the U.S. and North Korea to engage in talks soon?
Well, I think multiple channels have been open between the two governments. That's a good thing. They don't have to all happen, or shouldn't all happen, or mostly happen at the top level. So, as Scott Snyder suggested earlier, if this can now kickstart a process where the sides are starting to give concessions, then a deal can be struck and another summit could be arranged. I think it was very useful for the president to say there's no third summit planned. That is, give the process a chance. That's what should have happened before. Now we can give it a chance here this spring. Let's see what happens.
So my last question is, what should be U.S. strategy going forward? And I'll start with Mr. Countryman.
Well, I think Dr. Cronin outlined one crucial aspect of it is continue to keep the tension low, reduce the talk and the threat and the possibility of military action by either side, continue to keep economic pressure on, but most importantly, I hope that President Trump learned from Hanoi that he needs to really empower his negotiator, Mr. Biegun, and give Mr. Biegun the mandate to negotiate with North Korea even on small, limited steps, because this is not an issue that can be solved in a single meeting. This is a years-long process. We need to get started, and we need to do it in a more realistic fashion than the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder?
Well, this was a breakdown, but it wasn't a breakup. And so the fact that we have the chance to do this working level process is very important, and the critical issues are really over pace and price. It's the scope of denuclearization and the commensurate measures that can be taken related to the scope of sanctions relief.
I don't think the U.S. strategy should change, but the tactics now need to focus on redoubling diplomacy. Diplomacy at mid-levels with North Korea, but also very much doubling up on diplomacy with our ally in Seoul, but also in Tokyo. We need to make sure that we're talking more about a common approach, trying to persuade North Korea back to a reasonable baby step.
Mm-hmm. We'll end our discussion here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a picture of expanded bilateral meeting between the U.S. and North Korea in Hanoi. What role, if any, was National Security Advisor John Bolton playing in Hanoi? And will his role expand now that the talks have collapsed? Why don't we start with Dr. Cronin?
We'll find out more details in the coming weeks, no doubt. I think the National Security Advisor plays a vital role in pulling together whatever Secretary Pompeo, Special Representative Steve Biegun, and their teams negotiate into the White House, thinking it through the interagency process. No doubt it's a tough role, but if it can't get by the National Security Advisor, it's not going to get to Congress. It's never going to be implemented. So it's very important for there to be one policy on the U.S. side, and it's his responsibility as National Security Advisor to make sure it's a unified policy.
I think there's a lot of controversy over protocol issues related to this. This is actually a correct protocol decision, I believe. But in order to empower our special representative, I think it would have been a very nice optic to have the special representative at the table. Yes, the National Security Advisor is going to coordinate everything, but we really need, now that it looks like we're moving into a more intensified working level process, to show that the special representative who's going to be interacting with the North Koreans is really fully empowered to perform that task.
From the photo, you're not able to say what Mr. Bolton's role is at this meeting, but based on 20 years' experience, I think you can assume it is a negative role. Mr. Bolton is a serial assassin of arms control agreements. And keep in mind that primarily his urging is what ended in 2002 the agreed framework between the United States and North Korea, on which North Korea had been cheating, but which suspended plutonium production. And it was only after Mr. Bolton convinced the Bush administration to end that agreement that North Korea was able to detonate its first nuclear weapon. So I think you have to be suspicious of a process in which Mr. Bolton has a stronger hand than Mr. Biegun.
Mm-hmm. Anybody like to add to that?
Well, yeah, I would push back on that. I don't adjudicate the history, but he works for President Trump. President Trump is searching for a deal. He's authorized Mike Pompeo to do this. He's authorized the special representative to negotiate as much as he can at a mid-level with North Korea, very hard. His national security advisor is on that team. They're not really pursuing different policies.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we'll end our discussion here. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.